Welcome to the first of two short screencasts examining some of the key studies that you need to learn for the Component 2 exam on methods of sociological inquiry. Now, what you can see on the screen at the moment is the layout for the first section of the Component 2 exam on sociological methods. So you can see that you will get an item to read, and generally this will be a short description of a piece of sociological research. You get two 5-mark questions, and then you get this mini essay question which is marked out of 20. And one of the things to note about this mini essay question is it will always start with the instruction to make reference to the item and sociological studies, as we can see here. So the purpose of this screencast and the next one is to give you a range of sociological studies that you can apply in the Component 2 exam. In other words, I'm going to give you examples of real sociological studies to illustrate all of the main sociological methods. So let's begin by looking at some studies that you could use if you were to get an exam question on the use of experiments. And a very famous example of a laboratory experiment, which we've mentioned in relation to our media sociology work, is Bandura's experiment. So in this experiment, Bandura showed children a video of somebody beating up a Bobo doll, as you can see in these images, and then he put children into a room with a Bobo doll to see if they would imitate the behaviour that they'd previously seen on the video. So you can see this in the images that you've got on the screen at the moment. So this was the video that the children were shown, and then they were taken to this room and given a Bobo doll to play with after. And the findings of this experiment suggested that children tended to model the behaviour that they had witnessed in the video. And this has often been taken to imply that children may imitate aggressive behaviours witnessed in the mass media. However, Bandura's experiments have been heavily criticised by David Gauntlet. For example, David Gauntlet argues that it's difficult to generalise from aggression towards a Bobo doll to person-on-person violence. So the argument here is this type of experiment might lack ecological validity. It's a very artificial situation. Secondly, Gauntlet argues that it may be possible that the children were motivated simply to please the experimenter rather than to be aggressive. In other words, the children may have viewed the videos as instructions rather than incentives to feel more aggressive. Because of their artificiality, laboratory experiments are rarely used in sociological research, and if sociologists decide to use an experimental approach, they're more likely to use what we call a field experiment, which is an experiment that takes place in somebody's natural environment. And a very famous example of a field experiment was the work carried out by Alton Mayo. So this involved the factory management of the Hawthorne electrical plant in Chicago, hiring this researcher to study the links between working conditions and industrial output. So they were interested to see what kind of factors would make the workers more productive. And Mayo decided to conduct an experiment to show how changes in factors such as lighting, heating, and length of breaks affected work levels. So he changed the working conditions, in other words, the independent variable, and then measured the resulting changes in productivity, in other words, the dependent variable. And it was found that the workers' productivity increased regardless of how the researchers altered the working environment. For example, in the case of adjusting the lighting levels, all three of the groups of employees worked harder, even in the group where no change had actually been made. And initially the results made no sense until Mayo realised that the employees were working harder not because of the changes in their environment that were part of the experiment, but because they were aware that they were being watched and because they knew that Mayo would be reporting back to their boss on their work levels. So this experiment is the origin of the term the Hawthorne effect. Another very famous field experiment was the research carried out by Rosenthal and Jacobson in America in the 1960s. So these researchers wanted to test the hypothesis that teacher expectations had important effects on pupils' academic performance. So in this field experiment, they told teachers that 20% of their children had been tested and had been shown to have high intelligence and were expected to make rapid progress in the next academic year compared to other students. In reality, the students had been chosen totally at random, and they were no different from the other 80%. And within a year, those students whom the teachers were told were bright did make very rapid progress compared to other students. And this was seen as very powerful evidence that pupil progress was affected by teacher expectations, and that teachers' predictions of pupil progress could actually influence the progress that they made. In other words, this research seemed to provide powerful evidence of a self-fulfilling prophecy at work. However, this research posed ethical problems, as it may well have been that teachers' high expectations of the students labelled bright were linked with low expectations of the 80% that were labelled as not being bright, and this may have had negative consequences on their progress. So it could have also have created a self-fulfilling prophecy with negative effects on student progress for the majority of students. Let's now look at some studies that you could use in the exam if you were to get a question on participant observation. And one of the practical problems of doing participant observation is gaining access to the group in the first place, particularly if you're going to do covert observation. And some researchers have gone to great lengths to pass as one of the group that they're observing. And an extraordinary example is the one that you can see on the screen at the moment. So this is research carried out by John Howard Griffin, a white man who in 1959 used medication and sun lamp treatments to change his skin colour and pass as black. He then travelled around the deep south of the United States of America, experiencing through participant observation the impact of white racism. One of the big advantages of doing participant observation research is that the researcher may gain answers to questions which they hadn't anticipated. And this particular advantage, I think, is beautifully illustrated by the work that William White did when he became a participant observer of an Italian street corner gang in Boston. And we've got this wonderful quote here, which is worth remembering for the exam, where he says that as I sat and listened, I learned the answers to questions that I would not have had the sense to ask if I'd been getting my information solely on an interviewing basis. However, this research also highlights the way in which the presence of the researcher will change group behaviour and affect the validity of the data. And this is because the gang leader, who William White befriended, a guy that in the study is referred to as Doc, admits that his behaviour changed as a result of the observational work being carried out by William White. Participant observation of criminal and deviant groups can sometimes be quite dangerous for the researcher. For example, in a Glasgow gang observed by James Patrick, the pressure of living to the rules of the gang ultimately grew too much for the researcher James Patrick, and his unwillingness to participate in criminal activity arose suspicions amongst the rest of the group. And in the end, the pressure became too great, and Patrick was forced to abandon the research and to flee the gang. And such was his fear of reprisals that he actually delayed publication of his work for a number of years, and even then he published his research under a fake name. I'm going to end this screencast just by looking briefly at a couple of examples that you could use if the exam question was about questionnaires. So one of the practical advantages of using questionnaires is because they're a relatively quick and easy research method to administer, you can use it to study very large populations. For example, the famous height report into the sexual behaviour of American women was sent out to 100,000 people within America. However, one of the big problems with postal questionnaires is that you often get a very, very low response rate. And this is illustrated by this famous example, because out of the 100,000 postal questionnaires that were sent out, only 3,000 were returned. So only 3% of the sample replied, and this obviously undermined the representativeness of the survey and the ability to generalise on the basis of such a low response rate. Another problem with questionnaires arises when respondents give socially desirable answers rather than answers that are true and accurate. And this can obviously affect the validity of questionnaire data. So, for example, questionnaires have consistently shown a high level of church attendance in America, according to research carried out by the Gallup opinion poll company. However, when you actually look at the numbers of people that actually attend church, it tends to be much, much lower than the questionnaires suggest. So this strongly suggests that people are saying that they go to church regularly on these questionnaires because they think that's the socially desirable answer to give.